Hi everyone, Luigi Renzullo here, welcoming you to week 8 of Blue Planet and today's lecture on the water cycle. Specifically, I'm going to give you my perspective of the water cycle after many years working with satellite-based methods of estimating components of the water cycle. I'll share with you some of my insights. Before I move on, however, I want to acknowledge that I got some of these slides from my long-term friend and collaborator, Professor Albert Van Dyke. So today we'll talk about the water cycle. It's often viewed as an integrated system linking the atmosphere, the land, the oceans, and you can't really model the Earth system without encountering the water cycle. In fact, the interconnectedness between the water cycle and the carbon cycle are well understood, and they're often seen as two sides of the same coin, water and carbon cycle. I'm only going to touch on the water cycle, acknowledging that later on in this course you'll be going into further detail on the hydrologic cycle. So you'll get my flavour of the water cycle. Just before I move on to some nitty-gritty science, I do want to plug my research group at the Australian National University's Fenner School of Environment Society. I am a senior scientist in the Centre for Water and Landscape Dynamics, led by my mate Albert Van Dyke here. There's the crew. And really one of our main core missions is the better understanding of water resources through the integration of models, observations, and everything from satellites to ground-based measurements for better improving our forecasting ability of water resources. Key to that, my contributions to the team are to look at satellite-based methods for improving model prediction. This method is called data assimilation, and using better estimates of better products from space to better estimate rainfall, better estimate soil moisture. So yeah, that's our group. I hope that one day you can see one of your pictures up there beside the rest of us. But for now, any questions on water resources and the role for satellites in that space, please do ask me. So what does it mean to measure the water cycle? The water cycle, let's say, starts with everything, this course so far, the sun. The sun drives the heating of the earth, the radiation from the sun leads to evaporation of the oceans. Evaporation of the oceans leads to the atmosphere getting moist. Moisture can't be held and if the temperature of the air drops below dew point. So, and then that leads to cloud formation and rain. So everything you've learned to date gears you, prepares you for understanding the water cycle. But it all starts with the sun. So the sun heats the oceans, heats the lakes. That leads to evaporation from those water bodies. That's the source of moisture we get in the atmosphere. Then, through the mechanisms of pressure gradient forces, Coriolis, the prevailing winds, the circulation patterns, that moisture is transported from one place of the earth to the other. Depending on the atmospheric conditions there, that moisture in the atmosphere can condense into clouds, and when it gets heavy enough, coalesce enough precipitation. And when precipitation falls, how quickly it falls, the underlying temperature distribution in the atmosphere will determine if it falls as snow, sleet, or rain. So then when the rainfalls hit the ground, can soak into the ground, become part of what they call the soil moisture store. It percolates its way from the surface layers into the deeper layers and becomes part of the groundwater. Then you've got the bit that runs off from the surface. Sometimes rainfall can be at such a high rate that the ground can't soak it up fast enough, and it becomes surface runoff. Runoff follows the contours of the terrain, and it eventually finds itself to a lowest point terrain, which ultimately ends up in a lake or river, eventually the ocean. So all these processes of evaporation, condensation, percolation, runoff, infiltration. These are all things that you will encounter in greater detail in the near future. But for now, it's in understanding the connectedness of this system, how we might model this system. I won't go into that except to say that models do form an important part of encapsulating our understanding of the water cycle. And it's how we predict what will happen given certain perturbations to the Earth system. Scale is going to be a challenge, whether we talk about the leaf scale and the role of the stomata in photosynthesis through letting in CO2, but at the same time releasing water vapor into the atmosphere. This is at a scale of the tens to the hundredths of a meter, a millimeter. Right on the opposite end, you've got the planetary scale, the place where I sort of deal with the role of satellites in monitoring things like clouds and precipitation and soil moisture. So to bridge that scale, you're going to have to understand processes. And when you try to encapsulate these processes in the form of models describing the physics, you'll find that what might work at the cellular level, the leaf level, doesn't translate when you try to apply it to the whole globe. Similarly, what you apply to the whole globe for a matter of being able to be applied to the widest variety of conditions doesn't necessarily reproduce what we see at the macro level. So there is a challenge to bridge that scale. So how do we work across the vast range of scale? Well, you can look at the observations. So we've got small scale point observations. These are particular to any given place, and the question might be, how useful is what I measure here to understanding what's happening hundreds of meters away, a kilometre away, 1,000 kilometres away. So need to keep in mind this idea of how representative is this measurement to the area around it. You can then maybe spread these measurement devices, whatever they may be, across the landscape and get yourself spatial and temporal variation in the thing you're trying to measure. The problem is you can have a sparse network with gaps, and sometimes you because of limitations due to costs, maybe not inability to distribute the networks where they're needed, you have gaps, and therefore your picture of what's happening to the water cycle might be incomplete. Satellite observations can fill the gaps, but they are big picture, and you can lose a lot of detail by virtue of them spinning, orbiting the Earth tens of thousands of kilometres per hour. They can't hover over the same point for too long, so you tend to get pixelated pictures of the Earth by the way the images are acquired. They're not, and as well, these are measurements of the Earth leaving radiation, and that's not a direct measurement of the thing you might be interested in, like rainfall. You have to translate that measurement of radiation into a rainfall estimate, and that's not always an easy thing to do. But more importantly, observations tell us what's happened or what's happening now. They in themselves, they don't have any predictive capability. That's where models come in. But here we have an example of the distribution of rain gauges that report in real time across Australia. This one, for this date, there was about 1,700 gauges distributed across the country reporting 24-hour accumulated rainfall in real time to the Bureau of Meteorology. And while the distribution kind of looks, there's areas of the network that look kind of dense, when you zoom in, you've still got tens or hundreds of kilometres between gauges. So, and you don't have to have me to tell you that often it can be raining in North Canberra or north of the ACT, but be dry down south, and that's only a matter of 10 or 20 kilometres. So the distribution of gauges, while it looks impressively dense, can still be inadequate in capturing rain information. The Bureau of Meteorology's radar network offers you detailed measurements spatially where you've got the coverage. But there are, again, large parts of the country, like the gauge network, that are just not measured. Someone might say, well, why do we care about what happens in the middle of, say, northwest Western Australia? Because there's hardly anyone living there. But if you want a complete picture of what the water cycle's doing, you really need to fill in the gaps. Satellites are good at that. They can fill in the gaps. Coverage is great. And the only problem is we have to estimate from the radiances an estimate of the thing we want, which is rain rate. And because of the way the images are acquired, they become quite coarse. At the bottom here is my favorite satellite at the moment, the GPM satellite estimates. Those pixels are about 10 kilometers. This is the bottom tip of India. On the right, there's a slightly high resolution data set from a geostationary satellite over India called INSAT. Slightly better resolution, still quite pixelated. The thing is, you can see areas where these two estimates of effectively the same thing don't agree in the spatial shape of the rain and how much it rained. So you have to take that into account, that there'll be different ways of estimating the same thing. They can be better or worse than each other. That's something to keep in mind. So that's that limitation. As I said, modelling is a way to give us the predictive capability of what's happening to the water cycle. It's a way of encapsulating our best understanding of the physics of the water cycle. It can be very detailed. For any given location, you can have a highly parameterized model, but that then limits its ability to be applied over large areas. The converse is that the models can be overly simplistic and can't really represent the processes that you're interested in at a given scale that you want to work at. So then we develop models, and we have to parameterize them. There's parts of the models that we need to tune to get a best representation of system behavior. That process of tuning is called calibration. Once you've got a calibrated model, you want to see how good it performs. So you assess the performance against measurements, and that's called verification or validation. Models have predictive capability, but without observations, they're blind. Here's an example of where we can go from one extreme to the other. So we often have to make assumptions about, say, the rooting depth of vegetation. We might, in my case, for example, we call the root zone the soil layer from 0 to 100 centimeters, 1 meter down in the soil profile. However, you can see by this gentleman holding this roots can often penetrate deeper into the soil, depending what species of tree or plant you're looking at. How they access water, where they access water from will vary. So you can have a very highly parameterized model like described in the box on the right, with the canopy resistance. This is to describe evapotranspiration rates from a surface. The resistance from the stomata, from the overlying atmosphere, from the ground and the roots. Or you can just say ET, evapotranspiration, is the difference you get when you take everything away from precipitation, including the storage, the runoff, and the drainage. How you apply these, which of these you apply, really depends on the answer or the question you're trying to answer. And you have to really weigh up the suitability of one over the other to give the best accuracy. It's a compromise between accuracy, parameterization, and applicability over the widest area. And the driving principle behind that compromise is Occam's razor. The principle goes something along the lines of a model should be as complicated as necessary, but no more. While it's all well and good in principle, the idea is that occasionally we can be so driven by our getting the best accuracy, best representation of physical processes that we often lose sight that we want to be able to predict in the widest variety of conditions, and not just do one thing very well, but many things moderately well. So what's the solution? On the one hand, you've got ground observations, but they directly measure the thing you're interested in my case, rainfall, for example, but they're sparsely distributed, or they might be even infrequent in the way they measure the observations. And by themselves, ground-based observations are not predictive. Similarly, satellite observations, they have the full and frequent coverage that we want, but they don't measure exactly what we need. So you need to convert it into the thing you want. So they're indirect measurements of the thing you want. And again, being an observation, they're not predictive by themselves. Biophysical models, however, they are predictive. It can be interpreted. They describe the physics of the problem. They're fully spatially and in time and coverage in time and space is full and complete. But without the guidance of observations, they are blind and can be unhindered. So we've developed this term over the years called model data fusion. The idea that by combining all these sources of information in the one integrative framework, we can do better than any one of these things at understanding the water cycle than those observations, satellite or ground-based or models alone. So model data fusion, as the terms become known, can encompass a range. We call out the things like data fusion, data sharpening, merging or blending, model calibration, parameter estimation, data assimilation. So these are synonyms for data assimilation. And you can build your whole career on trying to come up with ways of merging, combining, assimilating these data to give you the best estimates of hydrologic cycle. Two key water variables that I've focused my career on are rainfall and precipitation and soil moisture.